Terror is not a new weapon. Throughout history, it has been used by those who could not prevail either by persuasion or example. But inevitably they fail, either because men are not afraid to die for a life worth living, or because the terrorists themselves came to realize that free men cannot be frightened by threats and that aggression would meet its own response.
It's time to engage your brain and enter the mind's eye on Z Talk Radio. I'm your host, Brian Turnov. One of the show's themes is the search for truth. Often, we dive deep down into the dark crevices of history to try and find small nuggets of truth. And in this way, on tonight's edition, we'll do our best to honor a man taken too early from us, like so many Americans and global citizens will do in just a few short days on November 22nd. The murder of President JFK was the defining tragedy of the 20th century. In the 51 years that have passed, there are more questions than plausible answers. For one former LA cop, private investigator, and professor of criminal justice, the time has come to expose the lies, cover-ups, and misinformation involved in this case. In Undeniable Truths, Professor Ed Souza applies modern investigative techniques and theories to present the clear and simple facts surrounding this infamous murder. Through the use of time-tested police strategies, the author puts decades of professional research to the task of solving one of history's most enduring, unsolved mysteries and crimes. Why was President Kennedy really murdered? Who really did and did not want Kennedy eliminated? Answers to these questions and much more on the other side of the break with Professor Ed Souza.
The very word secrecy is to the extent that it's in my control.
It's time to get deep down in the muck. We're back with former LA cop, Professor Ed Souza. Welcome to the Mind's Eye, Ed. I hope it's a little less rainy than it was yesterday over there and a little less cold.
Yes, actually, thank you. It was a little bit foul weather yesterday. We had some serious tornadoes actually struck in Florida, so it's nice to have that gone by.
Well, I hope nothing too bad on your end, and I know that you're a first timer on the show. So, if you don't mind, just talk a little bit about your credentials and your professional background, because it really helps us see why I invited you on tonight.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I started my career with the Los Angeles Police Department, and I sort of became a private investigator at the same time, working for a couple of retired LAPD officers. So my investigative skills go pretty far back. As far as my education goes, I have a bachelor's degree from Cal Poly, and that's in political science and history, and a master's degree from Kaplan University, and that's in criminal justice and executive management. And then my PhD work is done at Capella in criminology and public safety.
I would imagine that now that you're teaching a bit, it's a little less stressful than doing the beat on as a cop.
It's definitely something different. I've taken to it really well, though. I've even, I still do some private investigating and personal security. I have two friends that own agencies here in Florida, and they request my services once in a while, and I'll go help them. But it is nice. I've always enjoyed teaching. It's something that I have a passion for. So teaching my subject matter is always a great thing when I go to work. And my friends that are teaching English and math and other professors, they have it rough because I can go in there with some fresh stuff every day. I mean, just turn on the news.
Yeah,
there's some live events going on at the moment.
Yeah, I would imagine it gives you a little bit something more to chew on, not as dry. And reading the book that we're going to talk about, obviously about JFK, I can really see why you're probably an excellent teacher. You have an ability to really put some complex, difficult information out there and put it in a simple way, and that was part of the reason why I really enjoyed the book. So I'm sure that reflects in your ability to teach as well. No doubt about that. But let's get to the meat of the show, and I brought you here to talk about a pretty gut-wrenching tragedy in our country's history. Under the circumstances, it's a pleasure to have you here talking about it. And I wasn't even born yet when JFK was assassinated, and I believe you were a baby or a young boy when our 35th president was taken away from us. And from what I gathered in the book, Undeniable Truths, your interest in the JFK quote-unquote conspiracy is a familial passion. It's because of, it seemed like it kind of rubbed off from your dad a bit.
Yes, that's correct. My father was I was a baby, by the way. And my dad was an absolute passionate individual when it came to certain people and subjects, and JFK was one of them. My dad really felt that JFK was a very special, unique president, and I know people disagree with that maybe on a political standpoint. They say he didn't get much done, but my dad really taught me what it was like to be a true hero. My dad was in World War II. He was an older father, and he had a lot in common with JFK. They were both World War II veterans, and I think my dad really felt that was the largest tragedy he had seen in his lifetime, the death of an American president. And the way he was killed was so vile and despicable that when he discovered, that it had been more than what we were told, I think it incensed him to a point where he started to distrust a little bit of his government. Like, why would they cover this up? And so, yeah, he passed that on to me. I might have been 8 or 9 years old when I first started reading magazines about the JFK assassination. And, the pictures of Dealey Plaza, the location of the route. It wasn't until I was a little older that we even had the Zapruder film. That didn't come out until the 70s, I believe. So I did not actually see. I mostly read. And, Time Life did publish part of the Zapruder film, and my dad had that at home as well. So it kind of impacted me as a young boy. A lot of people may think, well, your dad let you read that. Well, he did. I actually, to some extent, I snuck the pictures of Kennedy being shot.
Yeah, I'm sure there was a limitation to what he brought to you.
I located those and saw those myself. He actually didn't hand me that magazine. I was pretty sneaky.
And because your dad, this passion to his search for the truth, and he realizing probably that there was something wrong, something smelled foul, and that I would imagine probably rubbed off on you as well. Was there a moment when you realized maybe, hey, we were probably or possibly hoodwinked? Was it one moment, like in a moment of epiphany, or was it a cumulative effect?
That's a good question. I think that there was a moment in time where I realized, and it probably had to do with my uncle who took me out and taught me how to shoot. My dad had enough shooting in the war, and my Uncle Joe had not been in the war. He was an avid hunter and NRA man, so he took me out to shoot pistols and rifles, shotguns. And when I first shot a bolt-action rifle, I think that the epitome that you were talking about probably was that day that I fired that bolt-action rifle with my uncle, because it started making me, I was about 11, maybe 12 then, and it really hit me like, wow, this is not an easy gun to shoot. And the fact that it takes a few seconds to actually, re-engage the target, that it kind of surprised me that it did take so long. And even when I got pretty good with it, it was still difficult to acquire your target again. Then you have to add in a moving target on top of that. So I was shooting at stationary targets. So that probably was one moment in time where I realized that, it was impossible for Oswald or anybody to have done that by themselves. So I wasn't at that point crystal clear, I was too young regarding a conspiracy or anything such like that. But I definitely knew something was wrong with the fact that they're telling us there was a single shooter at the scene.
And those little seeds that you brought about, that you just talked about, the difficulty of the shot, moving, how hard it is to keep reloading, those little seeds really play a huge part into your book and talking about the assassination. So without further ado, let's really get into it.
Sure.
And the book, it really called out to me from the start. It was released on my birthday near it, so right away it called for me. Something was saying, you got to read me. But really particularly because, you're a former police officer, and my father's a retired police officer. He remembers the day, but he doesn't really talk about it. So when someone from that profession and that type of structure goes against the grain, I always find it really interesting, their perspective, and I take it very seriously because they have that experience and background to talk about it. And, I consumed the book within days, and I was just wondering, the 50th anniversary was last year, but you released the book this year. Why did you wait that extra year? I'm just wondering. Or what really prompted you to write it?
Well, interesting point. I was actually, I'm a full-time professor, so I usually teach between 4 and 6 classes per term. I'm also a supervising professor as well, so I supervise other professors, and my life can get very busy. My intentions were good to release this last year, but as time went on, and this is my first book as well, so the editing process took quite a bit longer than I thought it was going to take. And, I'm kind of sort of a perfectionist being an academic, so I wanted to make sure this was a quality book. I knew it wasn't going to be perfect. Nobody writes perfect books.
No,
but I wanted to be as close as possible. So that I made that decision to say, okay, let's just move it into next year. So my goal was originally to publish it, in that group of some incredible books too that came out at the end of last year. But I think it's worked out actually better this time by releasing it this year. There's less books coming out on the market because the 50th has passed. So it's getting more, I guess, it's noticed a lot more than it might have been having been released in the other, I think maybe 50 or 60 books that were released at the end of last year. So that's what occurred with the release of the book.
And the time that you waited, the effort you put in, it really shows. And I think that's a great point what you brought up. It really didn't get watered down to a sense with all the other books coming out. And I think people have really taken notice. And the book, and we're going to talk about that right now, the book and research itself stands on the shoulders of giants, first-generation heroes, Jim Garrison, Mark Lane, who deserve a huge chunk of credit for laying down the foundation. And not to toot your own horn for a second, but the latter, who, Mark Lane, so important within JFK, he gave you a glowing review on Amazon. You must have been pretty bowled over when you read it.
Yes, I really was. Mark Lane is one of my heroes. I actually dedicated that book to him.
Right.
And I reached out to Mark and sent him a copy of the book and let him know what I thought of him. And he's been one of my heroes. There's a few heroes I have, but Mark Lane clearly, he's what I call the great-grandfather of the JFK assassination, the first whistleblower, so to speak. And yes, I was very humbled. He hasn't endorsed a book in many, many years, a couple of decades from what his personal assistant told me. So that really humbled me tremendously. And the way he gave me that endorsement, where he passed me the torch, is what he did, and that really put a chill down my spine when he said, welcome, Mr. Souza. And it's kind of like JFK. The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans. Well, this is, I guess, I'm a little older, but I'm the next generation down from them, and I will continue to carry that torch. And Vince Palomara also put an incredible endorsement for me on there. That was a riveting endorsement. He basically said it was one of the 3 best books he's ever read on the assassination. So that also was pretty chilling as well. I recently got Cyril Weck's endorsement.
Unbelievable.
Another hero.
And just quickly tell people who Cyril Weck is and how he fits in, because he is such another important figure.
He's a huge figure. Cyril Weck is a medical doctor, forensic pathologist, who served on the panel for the House Select Committee in the 70s. He was another whistleblower like Mark Lane, but in a medical forensic point. He argued his point very clearly from the beginning that there's no way the magic bullet existed, that Kennedy and Connally were not struck with the same bullet. And he was the standalone on that. Dr. Michael Baden, who I'm sure everybody knows from the Fox News, he's on there a lot, and in the Ferguson case, they used him as well. Unfortunately, they were looking at the old evidence. A lot of it was tainted, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners know. There were fraudulent pictures that were placed into the package, pictures with Kennedy's head fully intact. They later on were all discredited. But a lot of people, including Baden, looked at those pictures and said, well, there's a little bullet hole, there's no big hole in the back of the head, where Cyril Weck was a lot smarter than that, and he started to realize that there was something that had taken place here. So this is when he started his campaign, and he has been relentless. I'm working on a second book, and that book will be dedicated to Cyril Weck. He clearly stood out amongst medical doctors and really put them to task to prove their case. A lot of people don't realize, but it's on the burden of the state to prove their case against a client, or against a suspect, so to speak. And he put it to them to prove that the magic bullet was real, and they could never do it because it's not real. It did not occur the way the Warren Commission said it did. So Cyril Weck he's a general. He deserves recognition, and from me and from anybody who examines this case.
He's a true hero, and when you're given the torch by him and by Lane, you deserve it, and the book really shows that. And you're talking about the misinformation, and that's really why I brought you here, to strip the conjecture. There's just so much that seems to be misunderstood about the case, and obviously that was brought forth by the Warren Commission findings. And your spidey sense tells you otherwise about what the commission originally said. The first part that they said was Kennedy was killed and wounded by Lee Harvey Oswald from the 6th floor of the southeast corner of the Texas School Book Depository. And obviously in the book you argue differently, and you brought this really great evidence brought forward from a very logical, rational point of view. So start by laying out the case of why you think, obviously, the Warren Commission's findings weren't true. Most people start with the magic bullet theory. You were just talking about it. So go into that maybe a little bit more. I think that's probably the best place to start.
Oh, absolutely. The magic bullet was the bullet that supposedly had entered Kennedy at the rear of his neck, the base of his neck, and came through the front and entered Conley and ricocheted around and caused 7 wounds to 2 men. They came to this conclusion because there was no other way the Warren Commission, and I sound like Sarah Weck when he describes it, but there was no other way the Warren Commission could have solved the case, so to speak, with just a single shooter, because a 4th shot would have been impossible, and even they admitted that. Clearly an impossible shot. What's interesting to note, though, is that this information did not take place right away. As a matter of fact, if you listen to the phone conversation between J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, the day after, the FBI agents had determined at this point already that there were 3 shots, miraculously, but there was no missed shot in there. What Hoover told Johnson was 1 shot hit Kennedy in the back, 1 shot hit Conley, and 1 shot hit Kennedy in the head. That was what they determined initially for the first week or so. But when James Tague came forward, who had been hit with the ricochet from one of those shots that went astray, that changed the whole ballgame. We just lost James Tague a few months ago, and he deserves a lot of recognition too for coming forward and standing up to the powers that be at the time. He pushed it and said, no. Basically, if you don't take my story, I'm going to go somewhere else with it. And so they finally decided that, hey, we got to listen to this guy. He was struck. There were 2 police officers that saw this, and so it was entered in as evidence to the Warren Commission. So what's that mean? That means that we lose that shot. So we're down to 2 shots now. So this is where Arlen Specter, who invented the magic bullet theory, had to come up with a way to have all those wounds account back to 1 single round that was fired. What's so amazing, I quote a lot of information from the Warren Commission in my book. What a lot of people don't realize is that there's a lot of truth in the Warren Commission. If you look through the 26 volumes, some of it is superfluous. Some of it is just, like Jim Garrison said, talking about how they investigated Oswald's mother's teeth. Some ridiculous, it was just a real waste of time. But there is a lot of fact in there. The doctors who quoted to the Warren Commission what they had actually seen at Parkland, and the autopsy report. A lot of people in the conspiracy world think that the autopsy report was fictitious, but in reality, part of it was, but part of it was not. And the location of the wound in Kennedy's back is critical to the fact that it did not enter the rear of Kennedy's neck. It entered near the 3rd thoracic vertebrae, which is more in the center of the back. So that eliminates any entrance to the back of Kennedy's neck that would have come through and hit Conley, or could have. The second thing it does is it shows that that bullet that hit Kennedy in the 3rd thoracic vertebrae never exited his body. And this is confirmed by 2 FBI agents who filled out a 5-page report for J. Edgar Hoover and completely confirmed what the doctors had said, that that bullet did not come out. It did not exit. So now what do you have? Now you have no magic bullet. You have no entrance into Conley from President Kennedy. You also have a neck wound that had to come from the front. There's no entrance in the rear of the neck. So if you just take what I just told you in just maybe 4 minutes there, that completely blows this case to pieces. And does it say that Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy? No, it doesn't say that. Does it say that there was not a shooter in the 6th floor window? It doesn't say that. But what it does say is that there were multiple shooters, and one of them was in front of the vehicle. So I think if you ask me the most critical aspect, that would be it right there, what I just told you.
And, big part of what you just said was that the entrance and the exit wounds, and that shows you where the bullets came from. But has there ever been a time in your experience as a police officer where an exit wound can mimic an entrance wound or vice versa?
Well, sure, there can be times. What we did in the LAPD, we relied a lot on what the physicians said. We weren't medical doctors. We had seen a lot of shootings and a lot of murders. But there can be times, like for instance, a 9mm wound. If you have a 9mm that's fully jacketed, it's not a frangible bullet or a hollow point, and it goes into somebody, torso, let's say, and exits through their back, that can make a little hole. It doesn't come out large like you see in the movies when it's a full metal jacket
no, of
or
course.
a rounded lead bullet. So in that instance, you can tell if you look close enough that it's bigger than the one in the front. A lot of times bullet holes are little slits. They're not big gashes. They're just a little slit in the skin with a little bit of blood, and almost looks like somebody took a razor blade and just sliced the skin. Especially a round going as fast as a 9mm, it doesn't do a lot of damage on the way in. So the wound to Kennedy's throat, when the doctors first saw it, they looked at it and they knew it was a bullet wound. They could tell by looking at it, and it had all of the characteristics of an entrance wound because A, it was a rifle, not a pistol. So it had to be going very quickly, and they determined that had entered Kennedy's throat around just above the necktie area, I believe. It nicked the necktie as it went in. They used that as an entrance to supply air for a tracheotomy to President Kennedy. So they were very much aware that was an entrance wound. But you're right, you can't at times have trouble distinguishing. But certainly rifles and pistols, apples and oranges. A high-powered rifle,
Oh, most definitely.
even with when it comes through, even a fully jacketed round is going to make a significant hole.
And the reason I asked, that we're pretty much in line where we think what happened here, that the Warren Commission report probably, although, like you said, certain kernels of truth, most of it is kind of BS, but to be fair for the listener, we have to look at it on both sides. And that's the reason why I asked, because, one of the big people who are proponents of the magic bullet theory, they say that you can see a bullet hitting his head, and because the nerve exploded, that would push it going forward, make the head go forward, and you could supposedly see that on the film when you slow it down frame by frame. But to me, what you're saying makes the most sense, and that's a huge difference between the rifle and that high explosive gun. That makes a huge difference. To me, it just seems like...
If I can clarify a point, too, that you
Please.
just made. Kennedy's head, his body, what I believe is happening in that video of the Zabruta film is Kennedy was struck in the back. And when that motion, somebody actually sent me something on my Facebook page regarding that. Doesn't he move forward slightly?
Right,
just
exactly.
Before the headshot. And it's very possible that is when the back wound that hit Kennedy, and by the way, I formulate a theory, and it's strictly a theory because I don't have any way to prove this, but Kennedy was wearing a very tight back brace. He wore a nylon brace that was very tight to his body. I believe that the bullet that entered the third thoracic vertebrae possibly struck this back brace, which is why it didn't penetrate his body. And as a note, for sure, the bullet that was found at Parkland Hospital that many people think Jack Ruby deposited onto a stretcher, that bullet actually came out of that back wound. So a lot of people who talk about 399, Exhibit 399, as the magic bullet, if you look at it, it is slightly deformed. It's not perfect, but I believe, and so did the FBI and the Secret Service, that was the bullet that fell out of Kennedy's back. It only penetrated about an inch or two, and during the time that Kennedy was taken into the hospital, it eventually fell out on his stretcher. This is all in the FBI report. Clearly, they said that bullet was found on Kennedy's stretcher, not Conley's. So that bullet, even though it was going 2,000 feet per second, once it struck that back brace, it probably, almost like a trampoline, was pushed back out a little bit out of that wound, and later on it fell out onto the stretcher. So that is the so-called magic bullet everybody points to, and it really came out of Kennedy's body.
Wow,
I just thought I'd clear that up. But that shot right there that we're talking about, I think it pushed him forward slightly. I think he was hit a split second before he was hit in the head. He was actually struck in the back with that round. But it's hard to say, but that could be the reason his momentum went forward a little bit as well.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting theory. A lot of people don't take into account all the physical ailments that he had, and take into account the day of. That's a really interesting perspective and theory on that. And to me, it just seems like no matter, regardless of whatever your eyes tell you, people who don't want to believe just won't believe. And I guess it kind of goes both ways, but that's a side commentary right there. And we're talking about the exit and entrance wound, and one of the bigger enduring mysteries since the assassination is the fact that JFK's brain has gone missing, and has gone missing from the National Archives. And I'm wondering a couple things. If the brain was ever retrieved, would this help solve or would refute or confirm the magic bullet theory? And then what are your thoughts on the fact that it's missing as well?
Okay, well, the magic bullet has to do with that back wound. That's what Arlen Specter had used as the so-called magic bullet.
Right.
The headshot, which clearly entered Kennedy's head at the temple area. I mean, we have multiple witnesses who I describe in the book that clearly saw the bullet enter his temple. It did. If there was a bullet that entered the rear of his head, and I'm not saying that that's not possible, it could have been possible that there was simultaneously two shots that hit Kennedy in the head. A lot of people believe that, and it's theory. It can't be proven, and it can't be proven because the back of his head was blown out, and there was a large gaping hole the size of a softball back there. So it's impossible to tell if a bullet entered the back of his head. That may have been, but we only go by what we know and what we can prove. And the witnesses clearly, none of them said that they saw a bullet strike him in the back of the head. Nobody says that. Nobody saw it, but we have multiple witnesses that saw the bullet enter his temporal area. So that if you believe the witnesses and you believe the medical doctors at Parkland, you have to conclude that the shot entered his temple area.
And the reason why that's important is because the depository is not in that, it doesn't have that angle of a shot, right?
Correct. That had to be something coming from the right side of the vehicle to have entered his temple area. There's little doubt in my mind there was at least one shooter in front of the car, more than likely two shooters, because the reason I say that is another theory that I have in regards to, and I when I speculate, I say so in my book. Some things can be proven, some things are theory. But the shot that hit Kennedy in the throat, I'm certain it came from the front, unequivocally. The shot that hit him in the temple also came from the front. I don't think a person in the location who fired the temple shot could have been the same person that fired the throat shot. It's a bad angle. I've been to Dealey Plaza many times. It just doesn't line up. If you took that shot and hit him in the throat at the distance and at the trajectory, it doesn't match up with the same location if you fired that shot that hit him in the temple. So that tells me there's probably two locations somewhere on that knoll area where there were two shooters. And I'm sure, think about it, that first shot that hit him in the throat was well before he got to, or, was out on the side of the grassy knoll. This was further down after he had passed the school book depository and had just about come out from under the trees when that shot hit him in the throat. There's an AP photo that clearly, he took it the second that shot hit him in the throat. It's an amazing picture. I have it on my wall in my office. And so they were trying to hit him in the head, obviously. Had that shot hit him square in the forehead, it would have been over. Everybody would have packed up their guns and taken off. But it missed and hit him in the throat. So they had to continue on until they felt that they had a fatal blow to JFK at that point.
So you subscribe to that, the extra shots, if those, the other shots were coming from the grassy knoll. It wouldn't be coming from any other place. It would have to be coming from the grassy knoll.
There's a possibility. I've heard other experts speak on this. Some people believe that it could have come from the opposite side of the knoll, near the underpass, and that does line up in line with the potential throat shot from there. If you had a high-powered rifle with a scope from that distance, it could have come from the other side as well. But definitely, I believe wholeheartedly there were two shots that were fired from the front at two different locations. And and also another interesting point is the throat shot did not exit. That bullet, according to what I heard from the medical doctors at Parkland, that throat entered but never exited. It possibly hit his vertebrae and ricocheted inside his throat area or behind the wound. But it never came out. There's no wound. There's no exit wound to the back of Kennedy's neck. So that bullet stayed in the body. Now, that wound, by the time it got through the autopsy and they took the photos, was completely butchered. Malcolm Perry said there were several of the doctors made comments about that wound, that's not what it looked like when it left Parkland. It did not look that cut open, and it looked horrible. They said it looked like the work of a butcher when they looked at these photos later on down the road. And somebody, in my opinion, was digging around in there looking for that bullet and probably removed it prior to the autopsy, which is why they made such a huge, nasty hole, which can be seen in the official autopsy, the true official autopsy photos. You can see that wound is at least 3 or 4 inches wide. They completely tore it apart looking for that bullet, because obviously it wouldn't have matched the Mannlicher Carcano that they allegedly found upstairs.
To me, there's obvious post-mortem manipulation when you're looking at the pictures and then the description between what the Bethesda autopsy says and what all the Parkland doctors were saying. And with the grassy knoll, the reason to me, when you're looking, I've never been to Dallas, you know that, but from the pictures that you include in the book, which I really appreciated, by the way, because it really gave it almost like a first-person feel to it. I really felt as if I was there going through the description that you were talking about. And from the pictures that you included, it seemed like the grassy knoll really wouldn't be a great place to be taking a shot from. Not in the sense that it's a really good location to kill someone from, but it's really out in the open and would be a pretty terrible place to escape from afterward. But that's why I think grassy knoll wouldn't be that good. But then a revelation happened in the book when I was reading it, something that really blew my mind back and I never even heard before, that a Secret Service agent ID was stolen the night before when they were out breaching security on a night out in the town before the assassination, on top of that leaving Kennedy alone. Do you mind talking about that for a little bit? Because that one really was a revelation for me with everything.
Sure, absolutely. And most people have no clue that the president's protection was completely taken away the night
I had
before.
None.
And it's very sad, and this is absolutely 100% confirmed by the Warren Commission as well. As a matter of fact, the Supreme Court Justice was vehemently upset about this. Earl Warren, he voiced it in one of the hearings that was taped, actually, and he was very upset. And when he brought the Secret Service director in on that, instead of trying to defend anybody, he wholeheartedly admitted these agents were wrong. This was a bad scene, and it will be rectified, but they broke protocol, they were wrong, they weren't supposed to be drinking on duty. And on a side note, this is pretty funny how Bill O'Reilly in his book, which I cover in chapter 14, talks about how they don't drink on duty. Well, I guess he didn't read that part of the Warren Commission report, but the problem with what happened the night before, not just leaving Kennedy by himself, was that Abraham Bolden, a Secret Service agent, he admits to being part of the Secret Service detail at the time. He wrote Echoes from Dealey Plaza, I believe is his book, and he confirms that there was agents' IDs that were stolen that night, and it was brought to the attention of the Secret Service rather quickly, but they didn't have time, to remake these IDs. So it's theorized that the agents' IDs that were stolen were used by some of the conspirators, and these were the IDs that were shown to the Dallas police officers behind the grassy knoll. And it's important to note that there were no agents present anywhere but in the motorcade. So when you made that statement a few minutes ago that, how did they get away? Wouldn't it be obvious that somebody was shooting from behind the knoll? They had all that covered because the police caught the conspirators. They caught them behind the grassy knoll. They identified themselves, though. One identified himself as a Secret Service agent. One of them identified himself as a CIA agent, and they showed IDs and badges to these officers. So they got behind there pretty quickly. It was a matter of seconds, and I don't think they expected to have the officers get there that quickly. So they did catch some of the conspirators. As a matter of fact, Officer Weitzman would later identify the man that he saw behind the grassy knoll flashing the Secret Service badge as Bernard Barker, who was one of the Watergate burglars. He completely ID'd him as being the man that he encountered in the suit and trench coat behind the grassy knoll. So what was Bernard Barker doing there? That's another whole story we could talk about, who was one of the E. Howard Hunt's men, who was back there. Also, there were two other Secret Service fraudulent agents behind the school book depository. I don't know if you remember that in my book. I cover that as well, that other officers who went in and around the school book depository encountered fraudulent agents there as well. And what's amazing is none of this was ever taken seriously by the Warren Commission. And this is in their testimony. I mean, it's in my book, but it's also in the 26 volumes. Isn't that an interesting point, that why wouldn't they have brought this up? Who were these people that were masquerading as Secret Service and CIA? So they did catch these guys behind the grassy knoll. You can't get away with firing a high-powered rifle and not have people see it and hear it. And many of the witnesses saw this. The railroad workers, they heard the shot, saw the smoke, saw the rifle fire. The other witnesses that were running towards the area saw the smoke still dissipating in the air, and they smelled gunpowder. It's pretty amazing, but they got away because they had the ability to use these fake IDs and get people moving quickly and get them out of there. So that's my take on exactly what occurred behind the grassy knoll, with the fraudulent agents.
And to me, when I read that, I just stood still for about 10 minutes thinking about it and how much it makes sense. And for me, that was a really big piece of the puzzle. For me personally, thinking, hey, there's obviously some good proof to the grassy knoll, because the grassy knoll, like I said, I was always a little bit kind of wavering on and off. That really could be a good place to shoot it. But when I read that, oh boy, that was a big piece for me. And obviously everything that all the evidence that you've been presenting, it screams conspiracy, and not in the. I don't use that in the negative connotation way. I'm using it the way that has been used here. And obviously, the commission, the Warren report, clearly said emphatically, Oswald was not part of a conspiracy, nor was Jack Ruby the one who obviously killed him. Well, tell me who your thoughts on. So let's get into the who and the why. Let's start with Oswald. You don't think he was a shooter, or you do think he was a shooter, or what are your thoughts with Oswald? Because we don't really what you think there.
Sure. I don't personally. I don't think there's any way to prove 100% that he did or didn't shoot from that window. I mean, there's no evidence that he did shoot from that window. No one saw him. There was no fingerprints like around the window where he would have staged his hand or staged the rifle. There was no nitrates, even though originally they said there was nitrates. That was proven, and disproven completely. My mentor Mark Lane covered that many times over, that the nitrate test on Oswald's hands was negative. So with no eyewitness, the only witness...
and just to clarify there, that's the test that, which means he had no gun residue or anything like that on him, so he probably wasn't holding a gun or shooting a gun at least, excuse me.
That's correct, right. And they check your cheeks and your face and your hands to see if you fired a weapon. And originally, Henry Wade, the district attorney, said, that the tests were positive, but later on, even if you look at Chief Curry's book that he wrote in '73, I believe, he said the tests were negative. So they were negative, there's no doubt about it. And without any real eyewitness that saw him shooting, they had Howard Brennan, who wasn't wearing his prescription glasses that day, by the way. He said he saw a person standing in the window with the rifle, but he could not determine exactly who it was. He later failed to positively identify Oswald in a lineup. He just couldn't do it. Because, that's 100 yards away. The window is only half open. And it's an interesting point. I believe that he said he was standing, and then in Bill O'Reilly's book he said he was kneeling. And, it's really impossible. If you're out there on a sunny day, it's high noon, the sun's in your face, and you're going to say that you could clearly see somebody in that window and describe him, very difficult to do. So I come from a scientific standpoint, a forensic standpoint, a police officer standpoint. I cannot absolutely prove that Oswald was not in that window. Just like I can't prove that you weren't in my living room last night. I can't prove it. But it's the burden of proof is on the state. Had this gone to court, they would have had to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt that Oswald was in that window, and they could never have done that. And I believe he was in the lunchroom, just like he said he was. And in my book, I know that you've read it. I make that point very clear. What we do go on are the facts. The facts are that witnesses saw him in the lunchroom moments before the shooting. A police officer saw him in that same lunchroom seconds after the shooting. And of course, there's been all these tests where, they get a triathlete to run up and down the stairs, and he can do it in 90 seconds, and he could have pitched a rifle and made it down there. But, really, possibly, but theoretically, but actuality, you're going to tell me that he fired 3 precision shots from that window. Well, now we know it had to be 4 because there was no magic bullet. And that he's able to trample down those stairs, ditch that rifle, and show up in front of that cop, drinking a Coke, completely calm. No. I've unfortunately been in a couple of shootings, and you are a little bit nervous after you fired a rifle at somebody or a pistol. It's an unnerving event when you have to discharge a weapon in the line of duty. I'm sure every soldier listening to this or Marine will tell you it's a scary feeling after it's all occurred. You're not going to stand there perfectly calm with a Coke in your hand, eyeballing a police officer and be able to convince them that nothing happened. So, no, I don't think Oswald had anything to do with it, in my opinion.
And I agree with you definitely to a point. Then, if it wasn't Oswald, then we have to ask. The next question is, who was it and why? And in your book, you avoid pointing fingers as much as possible, and that's one of the biggest things that I appreciated about the book. You just wanted to give more of like a, the facts, the who, what, where, why, and then let people take those facts from your experience and make their own conclusions. But we have to talk about this, the who and the why. So
sure.
Who, if you were to point fingers, and that's probably, I would imagine, be part of your next book. So go into that. Where do you think the fault lies? Where was the conspiracy, and who was behind it?
Well, there's no doubt that we have to look at as much fact and evidence as we can to try to determine who did the shooting. Nobody took a picture of the shooters, for sure. We didn't find a gun behind the grassy knoll with fingerprints on it. And by the way, the Oswald rifle, there's a lot of strong evidence that was not even the rifle that was owned by Lee Harvey Oswald. That there's clearly differences with that weapon, and I've seen the differences. So that can't even be established if that was his weapon. But you have to look at what we have. Just let me give you an example, would be E. Howard Hunt. E. Howard Hunt admitted on his deathbed numerous times to his son on video and audio, I believe, that he was an organizer for the big event, which is what he called it. It was a group of CIA agents, the same ones, I believe, that broke into Watergate.
The plumbers, right.
Frank Sturgis, Morales, Bernard Barker, that whole group of people. I don't think Morales was at Watergate, but he is admitted to being, well, he's passed now, but had admitted to being in Dallas at the time. Some people speculate that he was involved with the Robert F. Kennedy assassination as well. And this group of assassins, who, now Hunt was not an assassin, I have to clarify that. Hunt, he didn't shoot anybody or anything. He was an organizer.
Right.
He was the master plumber who planned this. He wasn't a mechanic. Sturgis was, and so was Morales, clearly. And what was Bernard Barker doing behind the grassy knoll, identified by Weitzman? I mean, clearly, he's got to be part of this assassination team if he's behind there flashing, false credentials. So as far as, I think you're looking at it in two different aspects. I think those guys were part of the shooters. Now, I know there's people that talk about James Files, this mafia guy who claims he was on the grassy knoll with a Remington Fireball, a pistol with the scope, and he hit Kennedy. And there's holes all over the place in his story as a police detective. You look at something like that and take it apart. A lot of stuff he says does not line up, and some of it does, of course, but he could have easily come in behind this and pieced it all together enough to make people believe him. But clearly, we have some type of evidence that it was this group of CIA people who were doing the shooting. Now, the next question is who put them up to it? Who put them up to it? I'm sure that Morales and Sturgis and Hunt and Bernard Barker were not sitting having a barbecue and some beer and decided, hey, let's just kill Kennedy one day. Somebody had to pay them. Somebody had to put them up to it.
Yeah, that is something deeper.
I clearly believe that's the second part of your question, correct?
Right, exactly. I don't want to call them pawns because they had a big part of it, but to me, they were part of the action. There had to be someone there behind it. So who do you think was the man behind the curtain, so to speak?
Right. Well, a lot of people have come out, Roger Stone recently, and a lot of people have pointed the finger at Lyndon Johnson and as far as the Texas connection or the Texas syndicate as being part of the apparatus. That there's no doubt in my mind that Johnson knew or had something to do with this. I mean, clearly, somebody actually just posted something on one of my pages where they said, that was the first motorcade that Kennedy and Johnson were ever in together. I don't know that for a fact, but that's what he stated. It'd be interesting to find that out. But clearly, the Pentagon did not like Kennedy as well. Kennedy made a lot of enemies, and a lot of people talk about the mafia, like I said, with files. And the mafia, Jack Ruby was all mob. Clearly that was a mob hit. See, that's how mob, at the time anyways, how they killed people. They shot people with pistols at close range. They didn't take high-powered sniper rifles and go up in buildings or across the streets and fire at people with high-powered rifles. That's not the mob. The mob used to use automatic weapons many years ago in the 30s and 40s, but their method of assassination was clearly by pistol. Close range, make it personal. So I don't believe there were mobsters up in these buildings and surrounding Dealey Plaza with rifles. Those were trained assassins. Those were military personnel, people that had been trained in how to kill people, especially at moving targets.
So, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, when I say the Pentagon, too, that's where it gets sketchy. How do you put your finger on these people? I've done the best I could in that book to try to finger the people that I know there's evidence for. When somebody like E. Howard Hunt comes right out and says that I was part of this, that I participated in the big event, and he, in his deathbed confession, lists people. One of those people is Lyndon Baines Johnson, along with the other group that I just mentioned to you, the other assassins. But he puts Johnson right in there as the organizer. E. Howard Hunt said that Lyndon Baines Johnson organized and ordered the assassination. That's what he says. So, that's a very good possibility. And like I said, the other side would be the Pentagon, the military-industrial complex, as they're called, the group of people who had a lot of power back then. General Walker, the right-wing people that had control of the military at the time. Kennedy fired General Walker. He got him out of the military because he was, a John Birch Society member, really a real right-winger, and, he was influencing other people in the military. So the military was definitely very far right back then, and it wouldn't have been hard to convince people that they needed to dispose of Kennedy. But once again, the fingerprints, the actual physical evidence, and that's kind of hard to determine, 51 years later.
Yeah, no doubt about that, and I couldn't agree more with you, especially the military-industrial complex, where JFK, just a little before his assassination, was saying he was going to scatter them into little pieces into the wind. On top of that, in my opinion, I think it was a combination, the military-industrial complex, and then I also think that the banking had something to do with it, because he signed an executive order putting out debt-free money that would essentially negate the Federal Reserve. And the only two times that has ever happened was him and Abraham Lincoln both shot publicly in the head. So I think there's a combination there. That's just my opinion. But definitely on the military-industrial complex, I'm going to agree with you 100% there. And we're running out of time, so there's definitely a question I want to get to. There is the ARRB, the Assassination Records Review Board. I think it was dismantled in '94, but the law that came out from then said that the rest of the documents, about 50,000, are going to be released in 2017. Do you think we're going to get the smoking gun there, or is it a waste of time waiting?
Well, between you and I, Brian, I think we already have the smoking gun.
Agreed.
What the information I put in the book, and some of it's fairly new, some of it's been around, but the smoking gun is as close as we're going to get to understanding, who killed Kennedy and why he was killed. I don't really know. If nobody in your listening audience has read the information from the Assassinations Records Review Board, it's paralyzingly incredible information. I mean, they put a lot of work into that, and one of the chief investigators wrote a book, I think it's a 6-volume set actually, about what they found. And you see, these people were still alive then. Many of the witnesses, the doctors, medical personnel, and otherwise were still around in the early to mid-90s, and they re-interviewed everybody. They did a painstaking investigation, and they weren't tasked with trying to find out who did it. They were just tasked with, hey, this is the information. Is this factual? is this right? Is this correct information? So they went out and re-interviewed everybody, and the information they found was unbelievable. And this is where a lot of the powerful truth started to come out. So I think they did a great job in getting that out. You can thank Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was a lover of JFK. He wanted the truth to come out. He's always believed there was an assassination conspiracy involving Kennedy, and he became president, and he did something about it. He put it to task, and I think they came out with some really good information. So no, I don't think there's going to be anything really magical that's going to come out. I think a lot of it is out, which is why I wrote that book and why others continue to bring out the truth in this case.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And researchers, wonderful researchers like you, putting the pieces of the puzzle together in a way that's easily digestible and logical and rational is really why you're given that torch by Mark Lane. And before we sign off for the evening, you said you're going to write another book. Have you already started writing it, and what can we expect in the next one?
Well, actually, I've begun gathering information for it. It's going to cover the 1960s right up until Watergate. It's going to touch on JFK, of course, but it's not going to be as extensive as my book, Undeniable Truths. It's going to cover Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, even Malcolm X, Vietnam, J. Edgar Hoover, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Richard Nixon, who I didn't have time to talk about Richard Nixon, but his hands are dirty with a lot of stuff that people don't even know about Richard Nixon. He's a very deep, dark individual. He was around in the Eisenhower administration and ordered a lot of things that most people have no clue on what Nixon was about. So I'm going to cover him as well. And, just how the change took place. You mentioned the banking industry, the military-industrial complex, and who really took over our country? Because somebody took over our country. They took over our country in the 60s, and they haven't given it back yet, which is why we continue to have issues and wars and foreign lands and all kinds of information that's going to cover as much as I can on that topic, and, where America went wrong, why we're in the situation we're in today. So that kind of some of my nutshell topics for you.
Excellent. I don't know if JFK was the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning, or if it even really makes a difference, but I know you've been doing a few appearances. Give out your social media sites, tell people where they can get hands on the books, and talk about any appearances coming up if you have any. You can go on Facebook. It's JFK The Truth. You can just type that in. That's my Facebook page. That's my primary page. I'm also on Twitter, JFK Author, on there as well. And the book's available at Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Pretty much it's out there everywhere. Yeah, I did do some appearances. I had some great turnouts on Sunday. I had a great day here in Florida. I will start to do more as we get around the corner after the holidays. I plan on going to Dallas, Los Angeles, and maybe a location up north as well to do some book signings and appearances, and hopefully some news media clips will be coming out soon. So I'm trying to do my best to get it out there. Obviously, nobody knew who I was. I'm not Bill O'Reilly. I'm not Oprah Winfrey. So I'm just Professor Ed Souza. So I'm trying to get my name out there and get the book information as well to the public. And so far, I'm humbled, extremely humbled, not just from Mark Lane and Vince and Dr. Weck, but many people who have commented on my book and done reviews, and I thank them for that very much. And anybody who has read it or will read it, I thank you for that. I think it's well worth it. I don't think you're going to probably sell it after on Amazon as a book. I think you'll keep it. No, I definitely agree there, and it's one for the bookshelf if you're a true if you're an avid reader in the JFK conspiracy, or if you want to say, hey, here's some real evidence that says there's something has run amiss there. And I feel like we just kind of scratched the surface, and that was an unbelievably quick hour. But Professor Ed Souza, thank you so much for getting on the soapbox with me on this edition of The Mind's Eye. I loved your commentary, and I look forward to the next one.
Okay, thank you so much, and good night, everybody.
All right, we'll be in touch soon, Ed.
Okay, bye-bye.
And if you think the evidence that we've presented isn't damning enough, then at least let me tell you some of the people who have long believed in some kind of broader conspiracy that murdered JFK. 2 Warren Commission members, Hale Boggs and Richard Russell, JFK's late brother, RFK, his son RFK Jr., and if you haven't read this article that he penned in Rolling Stones, it is a must-read, and if you read between the lines, it is everything that we talked about tonight, including pretty much blame on the military-industrial complex. Obviously, E. Howard Hunt, who confessed to his initiation and his role in it, John Kerry, Jim Lehrer, journalist, former PBS anchor, Senator Gary Hart, and the list goes on and on. And if we didn't feed your conspiracy fix and need more, luckily I got the goods for you. Roll over to the Mind's Eye brand spanking new Facebook page at facebook.com/Mind's Eye Show. We'll be posting tons of info, media, commentary, and over 2 weeks until the end of the month. We'll be posting tons of info, media, commentary on JFK over the next 2 weeks until the end of the month. Facebook.com/Mind's Eye Show. When you're done there, check out themindseyemedia.com for more info on Ed Souza, cherry-pick news articles and videos, the complete set of archives for free, and so much more. All at themindseyemedia.com, mindseyemedia.com. One more show to go before the mid-season winter break. We're back in 2 weeks, Tuesday, December 2nd, with Jason Gregory, author of the cult classic Way of the Weirdo, filmmaker of The Sacred Sound of Creation, and an international lecturer. He'll talk about his latest, The Science and Practice of Humility. Until then, I'm your host, Brian Turnoff, for The Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio.
I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds.